there is a specific kind of silence that only exists in places where money flows, like water and blood is just another currency. You would think a high-end nightclub in the heart of New York City would be defined by the noise. And sure, on the surface, the Vigneto Club was chaos. The bass from the speakers was so deep it felt less like a sound and more like a physical hand pressing against your chest, rearranging your heartbeat to match its rhythm. There was the clinking of crystal glasses that cost more than my father's car, the high-pitched, artificial laughter of women in silk dresses, and the low, rumbling deals made by men in suits that cost $5,000. But if you listened closely, if you were like me, someone who had learned to survive by being invisible, you could hear the silence underneath. It was a cold, sharp silence. It was the sound of secrets being kept. It was the breath held before a trigger was pulled. My name is Elena Vance, and for the last 6 months, I have been a ghost in this velvet-draped world. I wore the uniform, a stiff white shirt, a black vest that was slightly too big for my frame, and a black bow tie that felt like a noose around my neck. I moved through the crowded tables with a tray of drinks, weaving between bodies that smelled of expensive cologne and danger. I wasn't here because I liked the glamour. I was here because of the number 80,000. That was the debt my father had left behind when his gambling addiction finally broke his spirit. But not before it broke our family. $80,000. That number haunted me. It was written on the ceiling when I woke up in my tiny, freezing apartment at 5:30 a.m. It was written in the steam of the shower, and it was etched into every tip I pocketed, every dollar bill I smoothed out and hid in my shoe. I told myself I just needed to survive one more shift. Just keep my head down. Do not look the patrons in the eye. Do not listen to their conversations. Be the furniture, be the ghost. But that night, the air felt different. It was heavy, charged with electricity, like the sky right before a summer storm breaks. It happened at exactly 11:45 p.m. I remembered the time because I had just checked my cheap plastic watch, calculating how many minutes until I could take my break and rest my aching feet. The heavy double doors at the entrance swung open, and the entire room seemed to tilt on its axis. The music didn't stop, but the energy shifted instantly. It was a wave of fear that rippled from the front of the room to the back. Conversations died out. Laughter was cut short in throats. He walked in. Dante Sterling. I had never seen him in person. But you didn't grow up in this city without knowing the name. They called him the Wolf. But looking at him then, I thought that was too tame a nickname. A wolf is a wild animal. It acts on instinct. The man walking through the club was something colder, more calculated. He was tall, wearing a black suit that fit him so perfectly it looked like a second skin. His face was a map of harsh lines and cold beauty, but it was his eyes that froze you. Even from across the room, they looked like shards of ice. He moved with a terrifying grace, flanked by 4 security guards who looked like they ate concrete for breakfast. But Dante didn't need them. You could tell just by looking at him that he was the most dangerous thing in the room. The manager, a sweaty little man named Marco, nearly tripped over his own feet rushing to greet him. I watched from the shadows near the bar as Marco guided Dante to the VIP booth, the one specifically reserved for royalty and crime lords, elevated slightly above the rest of the floor so he could look down on everyone else. I tried to make myself smaller. My instinct screamed at me to run, to hide in the kitchen until he left. But then Marco snapped his fingers at me. He pointed to the tray of reserve whiskey, the 50-year-old bottle that we weren't even allowed to touch without gloves, and then he pointed at Dante's table. My stomach dropped. I had to serve him. I took a breath that tasted like fear and stale smoke. I picked up the tray. My hands were trembling, so I tightened my grip until my knuckles turned white. Just do the job, I told myself. Pour the drink. Don't speak. Walk away. I made my way through the crowd. As I approached the VIP section, the air grew colder. Dante was sitting alone in the center of the booth, his guards posted at the perimeter. He wasn't looking at the dancers or the crowd. He was staring at the amber liquid in the glass already on the table, looking bored, looking lethal. I was 10 feet away when I stopped. It wasn't fear that stopped me. It was a movement. To my left, near the edge of the VIP railing, a man in a gray suit was leaning casually against a pillar. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like just another wealthy patron. But I saw his hand. It was a small, quick motion, like a magician's sleight of hand. As a waiter walked past with a fresh glass of water for Dante's table, the man in the gray suit flicked his wrist. I saw a tiny pinch of white powder fall from a ring on his finger. It dissolved into the water instantly. The waiter didn't notice. The guards didn't notice. Dante, staring at his phone now, didn't notice. But I saw it. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. That wasn't a party drug. The way the man in the gray suit tensed up. The way he immediately turned and started moving toward the exit that was an execution. I stood there, frozen. The waiter was placing the water glass down in front of Dante. If I did nothing, Dante Sterling would be dead in 5 minutes. And I would be safe. I could go home, feed my cat, and worry about the $80,000. But if I did nothing, I would be an accomplice to murder. I looked at Dante. For a split second, he looked up. He didn't see me. He just scanned the room with those dead, tired eyes. And in that moment, I didn't see a monster. I saw a man who was tired of being hunted. I couldn't let him die. Not like this. Not on my watch. But I couldn't scream poison. The man in the gray suit might still be watching. If I made a scene, I would be the next target. Or Dante's guards might shoot me before I finished the sentence. I had to be smart. I had to be the ghost. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out a cocktail napkin and a pen. My hand shook so badly I could barely write. I pressed the pen down, scribbling 3 words in messy, frantic letters. Don't drink it. I shoved the pen back into my pocket. I took a deep breath, fixed my face into a mask of servitude, and walked up to the table. The guards stepped forward to stop me, but I held up the bottle of expensive whiskey. They nodded and let me pass. I reached the table. Dante was reaching for the water glass, the poisoned glass. Your whiskey, sir, I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. I didn't pour it. Instead, I placed my tray down on the table with a clatter, just loud enough to make him pause. His hand hovered inches from the water. He looked up at me, annoyed. I didn't order that, he said. His voice was deep, a velvet growl that sent a shiver down my spine. Compliments of the house, I whispered. I reached out and took the water glass from in front of him. It was a violation of protocol. You never take a drink away from a guest until they are finished. Dante's eyes narrowed. Put that back. I didn't listen. I set the whiskey glass down in its place. And as I did, I slid the napkin underneath it. I made sure he saw it. I tapped the napkin once with my index finger, staring directly into his eyes, praying he would understand. Read it, I begged him silently. Please just read it. He frowned, his gaze dropping to the white napkin. I saw his eyes track the words. Don't. Drink. It. The realization hit him. His body went rigid. The boredom vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, sharp intensity. He looked at the water glass I was holding, then back at the whiskey, then at the napkin. I had done it. I had saved him. Now I had to get out of there. I turned around, clutching the tray to my chest, desperate to disappear back into the safety of the crowded bar. I took 1 step, 2 steps. Wait, he said. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Panic was rising in my throat like bile. I just wanted to be gone. I took a 3rd step. And then, I felt it. It happened so fast I couldn't react. A hand, large and incredibly strong, clamped around my wrist. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a shackle. The grip was iron hard, burning through the thin fabric of my shirt. I gasped and spun around. Dante Sterling hadn't stood up. He was still sitting there, looking completely relaxed to anyone watching from a distance, but his hand was gripping my arm, tethering me to him. He pulled me closer, just an inch, but it felt like he had dragged me across an ocean. He looked up at me, and this time, there was no boredom in his eyes. There was only a dark, terrifying curiosity. Who sent you? He asked, his voice low enough that only I could hear, but cold enough to freeze the blood in my veins. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him I was just a waitress, just a nobody who happened to have eyes. But no words came out. I was trapped in the gaze of the wolf, and I knew, with a sinking certainty, that my life as a ghost was over. The silence underneath the noise had been broken, and now, the real danger was just beginning. The grip on my wrist loosened, but the phantom burn of his fingers remained on my skin long after he let go. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stand still in the middle of the Vigneto Club. Dante Sterling was looking at me, really looking at me, with a gaze that dissected my soul. He was searching for a lie, for a hidden agenda, for the wire taped to my chest. But all he found was a trembling waitress who had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Before I could answer his question, before I could tell him that nobody sent me, that I was just a girl who didn't want to see a man die over a drink, the spell was broken. Marco, my manager, descended upon us like a vulture. He didn't see the poison. He didn't see the note I had slipped under the glass. All he saw was a lowly server disturbing the most dangerous man in New York. He saw a liability. I watched Dante lean back into the shadows of his booth. He didn't defend me. He didn't explain that I had just saved his life. He simply returned to that terrifying, regal silence, his face a mask of indifference. Maybe that was how kings survived. They took the miracles offered to them and discarded the messengers without a second thought. Marco grabbed my arm, roughly pulling me away from the VIP section. His fingers dug into the exact same spot Dante had held. But where Dante's touch had been electric, Marco's was just cruel. He dragged me through the kitchen doors, the noise of the club cutting off instantly, replaced by the hum of refrigerators and the shouting of cooks. He didn't even let me explain. He didn't want to hear about the man in the gray suit or the white powder. To him, I was just a girl from the slums who had forgotten her place. He told me I was done. He told me to turn in my apron and get out of his sight before he called security to throw me into the alley. I stood there, surrounded by the smell of grease and sanitizer, and felt my world crumble. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drag him out to the floor and show him the poisoned whiskey, but I knew it was useless. The glass would be gone by now, cleared away by a busboy, the evidence washed down a drain. So I did the only thing I could do. I took off the apron. I placed it on the stainless steel counter with a trembling hand. I walked out the back door into the alleyway. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind me, sealing off the warmth, the music, and the light. It was 3 a.m. The city of New York was supposed to be the city that never sleeps, but at 3 a.m. in the back alleys, it felt like a graveyard. The air was biting cold, the kind of damp chill that seeped through my thin coat and settled in my bones. I started walking. I didn't have money for a cab. I barely had money for the subway, but the trains stopped running to my neighborhood hours ago. So I walked. Every step was a reminder of the unfairness of it all. I had done the right thing. I had saved a human life, and my reward was destitution. I thought about my father. I thought about the hospital bed he had occupied for the last 2 years of his life, and the mountain of gambling debts he had left behind when his heart finally gave out. He was a good man with a bad sickness, but the loan sharks didn't care about morality. They only cared about the ledger, $80,000. That number pounded in my head with the rhythm of my footsteps on the pavement. Without this job, without the tips from the Vigneto Club, I wouldn't make the payment next week. And if I didn't make the payment, they wouldn't just send angry letters. They would send men with baseball bats. I walked for an hour, crossing the invisible border where the clean sidewalks of Manhattan gave way to the cracked pavement and flickering streetlights of my neighborhood. Here, the shadows were longer. The buildings leaned in like they were trying to crush you. I reached my building, a crumbling brick tenement that smelled of old cabbage and mildew. I climbed the 4 flights of stairs, my legs burning, my spirit dragging on the floor behind me. When I reached my door, I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs, loud in the silent hallway. The lock was intact. The door was closed. But there was something stuck to the wood, right at eye level. It was a red notice. Not an official eviction notice from a landlord, those were white. This was a piece of red construction paper, taped crudely to the paint. It had no words, just a drawing. A crude black marker sketch of an hourglass. Sand is running out. My breath hitched in my throat. It was them. The sharks. They had been here while I was at work. They had touched my door. They had stood right where I was standing. I ripped the paper down, crumbling it in my fist, and unlocked the door with shaking hands. I practically fell inside, slamming the deadbolt home behind me as if a thin piece of metal could keep out the monsters. My apartment was tiny. Just a single room with a mattress in the corner, a hot plate for a kitchen, and a window that didn't close all the way. But it was mine. It was the only sanctuary I had. I dropped my bag on the floor and slid down against the door, pulling my knees to my chest. The fight drained out of me. The adrenaline from the club was gone, leaving only a hollow, aching exhaustion. What am I going to do? I whispered into the dark. I looked at the crumpled red paper in my hand. They knew. They somehow knew I had lost my job, or maybe they just sensed weakness like blood in the water. The deadline was tomorrow. I had $1,200 in my stash, hidden inside an old coffee can under the sink. It wasn't enough. It wasn't even close to the interest payment. I closed my eyes, and hot tears finally spilled over. I cried for the injustice of it. I cried for the girl I used to be, the one who wanted to go to art school, before the debt swallowed her whole. I cried because I had saved a wolf, and the wolf had left me to be eaten by rats. The silence of the room was heavy, pressing down on me, and then the silence was shattered. Knock, knock, knock. I stopped breathing. The sound wasn't the frantic pounding of a landlord or the aggressive banging of the thugs. It was slow, heavy, precise. It was the knock of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. I scrambled backward, away from the door, pressing my back against the cold radiator. It was 3:45 a.m. No one came at this hour with good news. "Go away," I tried to say, but my voice was just a broken squeak. Knock, knock. The sound was commanding. It echoed through the thin walls of my apartment. My mind raced. Had the sharks come back early? Had they decided that waiting until tomorrow was too boring? I looked around for a weapon, a kitchen knife, a heavy book, anything, but I couldn't move. Fear had paralyzed me. I stared at the doorknob. It rattled slightly. Then, silence again. I waited, counting the beats of my own heart. 1, 2, 3. Maybe they had left. Maybe it was a mistake. Then, a voice came through the woods. It wasn't the gravelly voice of the lone shark enforcer. It was deep, smooth, and terrified me more than any shout ever could. "Open the door, Elena," I gasped. It wasn't a question, it was an order, and I knew that voice. It was the voice of the man I had saved. It was the voice of the man who had let me get fired. Dante Sterling was on the other side of my door, and for the first time that night, I realized that there might be something worse than debt collectors. There were monsters who wore expensive suits and tracked you down in the middle of the night. I had nowhere to run. We were 4 stories up. The only way out was through that door. Slowly, terrifyingly, the doorknob began to turn. I watched the doorknob turn, the brass mechanism screaming in the silence of the room. I pressed myself harder against the peeling wallpaper. My breath caught in a chest that felt too small for my heart. I expected violence. I expected the door to be kicked in, splintering wood and shattering the last barrier between me and the end of my life. But the door didn't break. It simply opened, and there he was. Dante Sterling filled the doorway of my apartment like a storm cloud filling a summer sky. In the harsh, flickering light of the hallway bulb, he looked even more terrifying than he had in the club. He was still wearing that impeccable black suit, not a single crease or speck of dust on it, a stark, painful contrast to the grime of my building. He looked at the water stains on my ceiling, the mattress on the floor, and the single cracked window. His expression didn't change. There was no pity, no disgust, just cold, clinical observation. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The lock clicked shut with a finality that echoed in my bones. I tried to speak, to ask him what he wanted, but my voice was gone. I was a mouse staring up at a hawk, waiting for the talons. He didn't attack me. He didn't pull a gun. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket. I flinched, squeezing my eyes shut, waiting for the flash of a muzzle. But when I opened them, he wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a piece of paper. He held it out to me. I hesitated, my hand shaking so badly I could barely lift it. I took the paper. It was a bank transfer receipt. I looked at the numbers, and the world seemed to spin. $80,000, paid in full. I looked up at him, confusion warring with terror. I asked him what this was. I asked him why he would do this. He looked at me with those ice blue eyes and told me that he didn't like debts. He told me that I had saved his life tonight, and Dante Sterling never owed anyone a favor. I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost knocked me over. He had paid it. My father's debt was gone. The sharks wouldn't come. I was free. But then, he spoke again, and the relief turned to ice water in my veins. He said that the debt to the loan sharks was paid, yes, but that didn't mean I was free. He explained, in that low, velvet voice that sounded like a caress and a threat all at once, that money was just a tool. He told me that he had looked into my life. He knew everything. He knew about my father, about the hospital bills, about the double shifts I worked just to eat ramen noodles in a room that smelled like mold. He took a step closer, invading my personal space until all I could smell was rain, expensive leather, and danger. He said he had a problem. He told me that tonight proved something important. He was surrounded by people who were paid to protect him, yet not one of them saw the poison. Only I did. Only the invisible girl in the corner saw the threat. He told me he needed eyes like mine. He wasn't offering me a job. He was telling me my new reality. He said that from this moment on, I belonged to him. He needed a personal housekeeper, someone to manage his private quarters, someone to taste his food before he ate it, someone to watch the shadows when he was too tired to look. My heart hammered against my ribs. He wanted me to be a human shield, a canary in a coal mine. I tried to protest. I told him I wasn't a bodyguard. I told him I just wanted to go back to my life, even if it was a miserable one. He laughed then. It was a dark, humorless sound. He asked me what life I was going back to. He pointed out that I had no job, no money, and no future. He reminded me that while he had paid the $80,000, he could easily unpay it. He could easily let the sharks know that I was unprotected again. It wasn't a choice. It was a golden cage being lowered around me. He gave me 5 minutes. He told me to pack whatever I couldn't live without and leave the rest. I stood there for a moment, paralyzed. This was insane. This was something out of a movie, not my life. I was going to go with a Mafia Don to his fortress, to live in the center of a target. But then I looked around my apartment. I looked at the red notice I had crumpled on the floor. I looked at the empty cupboards. I realized he was right. I had nothing here but fear. At least with him, the fear would be expensive. I moved like a robot. I grabbed my worn-out duffel bag. I packed my few changes of clothes, the photograph of my parents from before the sickness took them, and my sketchbook. That was it. That was the sum total of my 24 years on Earth. When I zipped the bag shut, Dante was waiting by the door. He didn't offer to carry it. He simply opened the door and walked out, expecting me to follow. And I did. We walked down the 4 flights of stairs in silence. I felt the eyes of my neighbors behind their peepholes, sensing the change in the atmosphere. The girl from 4B wasn't leaving for a shift. She was being taken. Outside, a black SUV was waiting at the curb, engine idling with a low purr. A driver in a suit opened the back door. Dante got in first. I hesitated on the sidewalk, looking up at my building one last time. It was a prison, but it was a familiar one. Where I was going, I didn't know the rules. "Get in, Elena." His voice drifted from the dark interior. I climbed in. The door shut with a heavy thud, sealing out the noise of the city. The interior smelled of new leather and safety. As the car pulled away, Dante didn't look at me. He pulled out his phone and started typing, already dismissing my presence. To him, this was just a transaction. He had bought a new security system. But as I sat there, clutching my bag to my chest, I watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows. We were moving higher, away from the slums, towards the skyline where the lights burned brighter and colder. I thought about the man in the gray suit at the club. I thought about the white powder. I realized that by saving Dante, I had painted a target on my own back. The people who wanted him dead would know I was the one who stopped them. I wasn't just a housekeeper. I was a loose end. And Dante was the only thing standing between me and a bullet. He turned to me then, as if he could hear my thoughts. He told me one last thing before the silence consumed us again. He said that in his house, I would see things that would terrify me. He said I would learn secrets that could get me killed. He told me that once I entered his world, there was no walking away. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't look away. I told myself that I had survived the sharks. I had survived hunger. I could survive him. I nodded. A silent acceptance of the devil's proposal. The car sped up, merging onto the highway, carrying me toward a life of luxury and lethal danger. The girl who served drinks was gone. I didn't know who I was becoming yet, but I knew one thing. I would not be invisible anymore. They say that the higher you climb, the thinner the air gets. I realized the truth of that the moment I stepped into Dante Sterling's penthouse. It wasn't just an apartment. It was a fortress of glass and steel, suspended 60 stories above the city that had tried to crush me. The elevator opened directly into a living space that was larger than the entire building I had grown up in. The floors were marble, cold enough to seep through the soles of my cheap sneakers. The walls were made of floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of New York, a sea of glittering lights that looked beautiful from up here, even though I knew the rot that lived down in the streets. But it was quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a library, but the sterile, suffocating quiet of a museum after hours. There were no personal photos, no clutter, no signs that a human being actually lived here. It felt like a showroom for a life that no one was allowed to touch. Dante didn't give me a tour. He simply pointed to a hallway on the west wing and told me that was my room. He told me the kitchen was fully stocked. He told me that at 8 a.m. sharp breakfast was to be served, and I was to be there to taste it. Then he disappeared into his office, and I was left alone in the most expensive prison cell in the world. My room was beautiful. The bed was covered in silk sheets that cost more than my father's medical bills. There was a walk-in closet filled with clothes in my size, simple, elegant, and devoid of color. Gray, black, white. It was as if he was erasing Elena Vance, the girl who liked bright red scarves and painted watercolors, and replacing her with a shadow. The first week was a blur of terror and routine. I learned quickly that my role wasn't really about cleaning or organizing. Dante had a staff for those faceless people who came in while we were asleep and vanished before we woke up. My role was survival. Every meal was a Russian roulette. The chef would prepare the food, but before Dante took a bite, I had to eat. A small portion of the steak, a sip of the wine, a spoonful of the soup. Then we would wait. 10 minutes. I would sit across from him at the long mahogany table, counting the seconds on the grandfather clock in the corner. I would listen to my own body, waiting for the cramp, the burning, the dizziness that would signal poison. Dante would watch me. He didn't eat. He just watched, his eyes tracing my face, looking for signs of distress. In those 10 minutes, we were the most intimate two people on Earth. My life was literally in his hands, and his life depended on my survival. I remember thinking on the third day, as I swallowed a piece of sea bass that tasted like ash because I was so afraid, that this was the cruelest form of torture. He was making me the barrier between him and death. But then, something shifted. It was late, maybe 2:30 a.m. I couldn't sleep. The silence of the penthouse was too loud compared to the sirens and shouting I was used to in my old neighborhood. I wandered out into the living room, wrapping my silk robe tight around me. I thought everyone was asleep, but then I saw him. Dante was standing by the window, staring out at the city. He wasn't wearing his suit armor. He was in a white dress shirt, the top buttons undone, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He held a glass of whiskey in one hand, but he wasn't drinking it. I froze, about to turn back, but he spoke without turning around. He asked me if I was planning to poison him in his sleep, or if I was just haunting the halls. His voice didn't have the cold edge it usually did. It sounded exhausted. I walked closer, drawn in by a curiosity that was stronger than my fear. I told him I couldn't sleep. I told him it was too quiet up here. He turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw the man beneath the monster. The moonlight washed over him, highlighting the deep purple shadows under his eyes, and then I saw the scars. They were on his forearms, jagged white lines that mapped a history of violence, knife wounds, burns, bullet grazes. I realized then that he wasn't just the predator. He was the survivor of a war I couldn't even imagine. He saw me looking. Most men would have covered up, hidden their weakness. Dante just took a sip of his drink and asked me if the view frightened me. I looked out at the city. I told him no. I told him that from up here everything looked small, manageable. He let out a short, dry laugh. He said that was the illusion. He said that height didn't make you safe. It just made the fall longer. That night, we didn't talk about the Mafia, or the debt, or the poison. We stood there in the dark, two insomniacs sharing a bottle of whiskey. He asked me about my drawing. He had seen the sketchbook I brought. I was shocked he had noticed. I told him I used to want to be an artist, before life got in the way. He looked at me, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He told me that life doesn't get in the way. He said we choose what we sacrifice. He said he sacrificed his peace for power. I sacrificed my art for my father. He asked me if it was worth it. I thought about my father dying in a hospital bed, apologizing for leaving me with nothing. I felt the familiar sting of tears, but I blinked them back. I told him yes. I told him I would do it again. Dante stared at me for a long time. The air between us changed. It wasn't the tension of the poison testing anymore. It was something heavier, something magnetic. He stepped closer, invading my space, but I didn't back away. He reached out, his hand hovering near my face, and for a second, I thought he was going to touch me. I stopped breathing, but he just tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers were rough, callous against my skin, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He whispered that I was a fool. He said loyalty was a rare currency, and spending it on the dead was a waste. But his eyes told a different story. I saw a flash of something that looked like longing, like he wished he had someone who would sacrifice their art for him. Then he pulled back, the mask slamming back into place. He told me to go to bed. I went back to my room, but I didn't sleep. I lay there touching the spot behind my ear where his fingers had grazed. Over the next few weeks, the gilded cage started to feel less like a prison and more like a home. The fear began to fade, replaced by a strange, twisted sense of belonging. I started anticipating his needs before he asked. I knew he liked his coffee black, no sugar, at exactly 6 a.m. I knew that when he rubbed his left temple, he had a migraine coming on, and I would silently place a glass of water and aspirin on his desk. And he changed, too. The testing times at dinner became less about silence and more about conversation. He started asking me what I thought about the news, about the city, about the people he did business with. I realized he was testing something else now. He wasn't just testing for poison. He was testing my mind. He was testing my intuition. One evening, he brought a man home for a meeting. A business partner from Chicago. I was serving wine, playing the part of the invisible maid, but as I poured the Merlot, I noticed the way the guest's eyes darted around the room, how he tapped his foot nervously, how he checked his watch 3 times in 1 minute. After the man left, Dante asked me what I thought. I didn't hesitate. I told him the man was lying. I told him he was desperate, likely in debt to someone else, and he was here to sell Dante out. Dante looked at me, surprised. He asked how I knew. I told him I knew the look of a desperate man. I had seen it in the mirror for 3 years. I had seen it in my father. Dante smiled. It was the first real smile I had ever seen him wear. It wasn't cruel. It was impressive. He told me I was right. He told me the man was a mole for the Russian syndicate. That night, as I lay in the silk sheets, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. I liked the danger. I liked the way Dante looked at me when I solved a puzzle. I was falling in love with the monster. And I knew that in this world, love wasn't a fairy tale. Love was a weakness. Love was the crack in the armor where the knife would eventually slide in. But as I drifted off to sleep, listening to the wind howl against the 60-story glass, I knew it was too late to turn back. I was already in the cage, and for the first time in my life, I didn't want the key. They say the calm before the storm is a cliché, but that night, the silence in the penthouse felt heavy, like the air inside a bell jar right before the glass shatters. It had been 3 months since I walked into Dante Sterling's world. 3 months of taste-testing his meals, watching his back, and living in the strange, suspended reality of his protection. We had fallen into a rhythm, a dance where we circled each other without ever touching. It was 11:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. A rainstorm was hammering against the glass walls of the living room, turning the view of New York into a blurred watercolor painting of gray and black. Dante was sitting on the leather sofa, reviewing contracts. I was sitting on the floor a few feet away, sketching the way the light hit the sharp angle of his jaw. It was peaceful. It was domestic. And then, the world exploded. There was no warning, no alarm. Just a deafening boom that shook the floorboards beneath me. The reinforced glass of the balcony, which was supposed to be bulletproof, spiderwebbed into a million fractures before shattering inward under the force of a blast. Wind and rain roared into the room instantly, carrying with it the smell of sulfur and burning plastic. I didn't even have time to scream. Before my brain could process that we were under attack, Dante was moving. He didn't run for the door. He didn't reach for the gun holstered under the coffee table. He launched himself at me. He hit me with the force of a linebacker, tackling me to the ground. His heavy body covered mine completely, shielding me from the wave of glass shards and debris that sprayed across the room like shrapnel. I felt the impact of something hitting his back, a heavy thud that made him grunt in pain near my ear. Gunfire erupted from the balcony. Automatic weapons. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Dante rolled off me, dragging me up by my arm. His face was a mask of pure, feral rage. He shoved me toward the hallway, shouting over the noise of the wind and the bullets. He told me to run. He told me to get to the library. I scrambled on my hands and knees, my ears ringing. I looked back for a split second. Dante was returning fire, a gun in his hand that I hadn't even seen him draw. He was standing in the open, making himself a target to buy me time. I saw a red bloom expanding on the white shoulder of his dress shirt. He was hit. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through the shock. The wolf was bleeding. I didn't run to the library. I ran to him. He screamed at me to go, but I ignored him. I grabbed his arm, pulling with all my strength. I knew the layout of this penthouse better than the attackers did. I knew about the panic room hidden behind the mahogany bookcase because I had found the mechanism while cleaning the dust 2 weeks ago. I dragged him. He was losing blood fast, stumbling, his movements heavy. The invincible king was suddenly mortal. We made it to the library. I slammed the heavy oak doors and locked them, knowing it would only buy us seconds. I ran to the third bookshelf from the left. I pulled the fake copy of The Divine Comedy, and the hidden hydraulics hissed. The shelf swung open. I shoved Dante inside and scrambled in after him, hitting the seal button just as the library doors splintered under a hail of bullets. The panic room door slid shut with a heavy metallic clank. Silence returned. We were in a small, concrete box. It was cold. The only light came from a strip of emergency LEDs along the floor. Dante slid down the wall, leaving a streak of dark blood on the gray concrete. He was breathing hard, ragged gasps that rattled in his chest. I fell to my knees beside him. My hands were shaking, but my mind was strangely clear. I had to stop the bleeding. I ripped open his shirt. The buttons were scattered on the floor like tiny pearls. The wound was on his left shoulder, a through-and-through shot. It was messy, and there was so much blood. It soaked my hands, warm and sticky, smelling of copper. I grabbed a sterile pack from the emergency kit on the wall and pressed it against the wound. Dante groaned, his head falling back against the wall. His eyes were squeezed shut, sweat beading on his forehead. I pressed harder, using my body weight to stem the flow. I told him to stay with me. I told him not to dare close his eyes. He opened them. In the dim light, his blue eyes were almost black. He looked at me, and I saw something that scared me more than the gunman outside. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid for me. He grabbed my wrist with his good hand, his grip weak but desperate. He asked me if I was hurt. He demanded to know if I was bleeding. I told him I was fine. I told him he was the idiot who got shot. He let out a jagged breath. He told me I should have run. He said I was supposed to go to the safe room alone, that he was supposed to hold them off. I felt a surge of anger mixed with the panic. I asked him if he thought I would just leave him to die. I asked him if he thought he was the only one allowed to make sacrifices. He looked at my hands, covered in his blood, pressing on his chest. He looked at my face, wet with rain and tears, and I didn't know I was crying. "You're a fool, Elena," he whispered. But there was no bite in the words. "I'm alive because of you," I whispered back. The air in the small room became suffocating. The adrenaline was still pumping through our veins, making every nerve ending feel exposed. We were two survivors in a lifeboat, adrift in a sea of violence. He reached up with his blood-stained hand and cupped my cheek. His thumb brushed over my lip. "You're my weakness," he said. It sounded like a confession of a sin. They know it now. They know if they want to get to me, they just have to aim at you. I leaned into his touch. I didn't care about the blood. I didn't care that he was a criminal and I was a waitress. "Then let them try," I said. Something in him snapped. He pulled me down. His lips crashed onto mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It wasn't tentative. It was a collision. It tasted of iron and rain and desperation. It was the kiss of a man who thought he was going to die, claiming the only thing that made him want to live. I kissed him back with everything I had. I poured all my fear, all my anger, and all the silent longing of the last 3 months into that kiss. I tangled my hands in his hair, pulling him closer, trying to merge our souls so that nothing could ever tear us apart. For a moment, the pain, the gunshot, the men with guns outside it all faded. There was only him, only the heat of his skin and the beat of his heart against my chest. When we finally broke apart, gasping for air, our foreheads resting against each other, the reality of the situation crashed back down on us. I looked at him, his lips swollen, his eyes wide and vulnerable. I realized then that he was right. I was his weakness. Tonight, he had taken a bullet because he hesitated. He had thrown his body over mine instead of taking cover. If I stayed, I would kill him. Not with poison, but with love. My presence in his life was more dangerous than any assassin. Dante closed his eyes, his breathing slowing down as the pain meds from the kit I had injected him with started to kick in. He held my hand tightly, refusing to let go even in sleep. I sat there in the dim light of the panic room, listening to the muffled sounds of sirens in the distance. The police, or maybe Dante's men, had finally arrived. We were safe, but as I looked at the man I loved, sleeping fitfully with a hole in his shoulder, I knew what I had to do. The note I had written on the napkin that first night, "Don't drink it," had saved him from poison. But now, I was the poison. I wiped a tear from my cheek, leaving a smear of his blood on my skin. I had to leave. If I loved him, I had to break his heart to save his life. They say the sun always rises, even after the darkest nights. But when the sun eventually crept through the shattered windows of the penthouse that morning, it didn't bring warmth. It brought a cold, blinding clarity. I had fallen asleep in a plastic chair next to Dante's bed, my hand still holding his. But when I woke up, his hand was gone. Dante was awake. He was sitting up against the pillows, his chest bandaged, his face pale and drawn. But it wasn't the injury that scared me. It was his eyes. The vulnerability I had seen in the panic room, the fear, the desperation, the love was gone. It had been scrubbed away, replaced by a wall of ice so thick I could feel the chill from across the room. The wolf was back, and he was cornered. I stood up, smiling, relief washing over me that he was alive. I started to ask him how he felt, but he cut me off. His voice was like grinding glass. He didn't look at me. He looked at the wall, at the city skyline, at anything but me. He told me to pack my bags. I froze. I thought he was joking, or maybe he was delirious from the pain medication. I tried to reach for him, to touch his forehead, but he flinched away as if my skin were acid. He told me again, "Leave." He said that last night was a mistake. He said that adrenaline makes people do stupid things, makes them think they feel things they don't. He told me that I was a liability. He said he couldn't run an empire if he had to spend every second worrying about a waitress who didn't know how to duck a bullet. Every word was a precision strike, aimed exactly at the places he knew would hurt the most. He was trying to make me hate him. He picked up an envelope from the bedside table. I didn't know when he had prepared it, maybe while I was sleeping. Maybe he had called his lawyer the second he woke up. He tossed it onto the bed. It was thick with cash. He told me it was payment for my services. He told me to take it, go to the airport, and pick a city on the other side of the world. He told me that if I ever came back to New York, he would kill me himself. I stood there, feeling my heart shatter into a million jagged pieces. But as I looked at him, I really looked at him, I saw the truth. His hands were clenched into fists under the sheets, trembling slightly. A vein was pulsing in his jaw. He wasn't looking at me because he couldn't. If he looked at me, he would break. He wasn't sending me away because he hated me. He was sending me away because he loved me too much to watch me die. He knew that as long as I was here, his enemies had a target. He was cutting off his own limb to save the body. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I picked up the envelope. I told him I understood. I told him he was right, I didn't belong here. I walked out of the room without looking back. I packed my duffel bag, the same worn-out bag I had arrived with 3 months ago. I left the expensive clothes. I left the jewelry. I took only what was mine. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like a funeral procession. The security guards wouldn't meet my eyes. They knew. Everyone knew the king had exiled his queen. I walked out onto the street. The air was crisp, filled with the noise of traffic and the smell of exhaust. I hailed a cab. JFK Airport, the driver said, assuming. No, I said. Drive. I sat in the back seat, clutching the envelope of money. I closed my eyes and thought about the man upstairs, bleeding alone in his tower. He thought he had saved me. He thought I would take the money and run to Paris or Tokyo and live a long, safe, miserable life. But he had forgotten one thing. He had taught me how to survive in his world. He had taught me that sometimes, to win a war, you have to make a sacrifice that no one expects. I wasn't going to leave him. I knew his enemies. I knew who had ordered the hit last night. It was the Petrov Syndicate. I remembered the name from the dossier I had seen on his desk weeks ago. I remembered the location of their front, a warehouse club in the meatpacking district called the Red Room. If I left now, they would attack Dante again. He was weak. He was injured. He would be dead within a week. There was only one way to stop them. I leaned forward and gave the driver a new address. He looked at me in the rearview mirror, confused. He told me that it wasn't a place for a young lady. I told him to just drive. When the cab pulled up to the warehouse, it was just past noon. But the place looked menacing even in the daylight. Blacked-out windows, heavy steel doors, 2 men the size of vending machines standing guard. I paid the driver and stepped out. My legs were shaking, but my head was high. I wasn't Elena the waitress anymore. I was the woman who had loved a wolf. I walked straight up to the guards. They stepped forward to block me, sneering, telling me the club was closed. I didn't flinch. I looked the biggest one in the eye and told him to tell his boss, Viktor Petrov, that I had a gift for him. He laughed. He asked me what kind of gift a girl like me could possibly have. I told him my name. I told him I was Elena Vance, the woman Dante Sterling had taken a bullet for. The laughter died instantly. The guard spoke into his earpiece, his eyes never leaving my face. A moment later, the steel door buzzed and clicked open. They led me inside. The club smelled of stale vodka and violence. They marched me through the empty dance floor, past the VIP booths, into a back office that smelled of expensive cigars. Viktor Petrov was sitting behind a massive desk. He was an older man with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He looked up as I entered, a flicker of surprise in his cold gray eyes. He asked me why I was here. He asked me if Dante had sent me to beg for mercy. I stood tall, refusing to let him see the terror clawing at my throat. I told him no. I told him Dante had thrown me out. I told him Dante didn't care about me anymore. Victor laughed. He stood up and walked around the desk, circling me like a predator inspecting a meal. He said he didn't believe me. He said his spies saw what happened last night. He saw Dante jump in front of a bullet for me. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him that was exactly why I was here. I told him that I knew he wanted Dante dead. I knew he was planning to strike again while Dante was recovering. I took a step forward. I told him he could try to attack the penthouse again, but Dante's men would be ready now. It would be a bloodbath. He would lose half his army, or he could take the easy win. I spread my arms, offering myself up. I told him I was the only thing Dante cared about, even if he wouldn't admit it. I told him that if he held me, if he threatened to kill me, Dante would surrender. He would give up his territory. He would give up his empire. He would walk unarmed into a trap to save me. I was offering myself as the ultimate bait. Victor stared at me for a long, agonizing minute. He was calculating, weighing the risk. Then, a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He told me I was either very brave or very stupid. He said he liked that. He snapped his fingers. 2 guards grabbed my arms. They were rough, twisting my shoulders back. The pain was sharp, real. Victor leaned in close, blowing smoke in my face. He told me he accepted the offer. He said we would see just how much the wolf loved his little stray. As they dragged me away toward the basement cells, I didn't struggle. I didn't cry out. I closed my eyes and pictured Dante. He was probably still staring at the wall, thinking I was halfway to the airport. He thought he had saved me. He was wrong. I was saving him. Viktor Petrov didn't tie me up. He was too arrogant for that. He just sat me in a heavy leather chair in the center of his office, flanked by his guards, treating me like a bird with a broken wing that he could crush whenever he got bored. He spent 10 minutes pacing the room, blowing thick clouds of cigar smoke into the air, detailing exactly how he was going to use me. He talked about making a video call to Dante. He talked about demanding territory, trade routes, and millions in cash. He looked at me with a sneer and told me that love was a fatal flaw in men like Dante. He said the wolf had gone soft, and he was going to be the one to put him down. I sat there, listening to the drone of his voice. 10 minutes ago, I would have been trembling. I would have been the girl who cried over a spilled tray of drinks. But as I watched Petrov gloat, I felt something inside me shift. The fear didn't just fade. It evaporated, burned away by a cold, white-hot clarity. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 12:45 p.m. Petrov was still talking, boasting about his genius. I interrupted him. My voice was quiet, steady, and completely devoid of the terror he wanted to hear. I asked him if he had checked his secure email server in the last 5 minutes. He stopped pacing. He looked at me, confused, annoyed that the prop was speaking. He asked me what I was talking about. I leaned back in the chair, crossing my legs. I told him that before I walked into this warehouse, I had set a timer on my phone. I told him that Dante kept detailed files on all his enemies, including the Russian syndicate. I told him I had memorized the account numbers for the offshore shell companies Petrov used to steal from his own bosses in Moscow. I saw the color drain from his face. The cigar froze halfway to his mouth. I continued, feeling a surge of power I had never known before. I told him that I had set up a dead man's switch. If I didn't enter a code by 12:40 p.m., an email containing those account numbers, along with dates and amounts of every dollar he had skimmed, would be automatically sent to the High Commission. I pointed to the clock. It was 12:46. I told him the email was already sent. Petrov dropped his cigar. It burned a hole in the expensive Persian rug, but he didn't notice. He scrambled to his computer, his hands shaking so badly he could barely type. He stared at the screen, and I watched his world collapse. He screamed. It was a raw, animal sound of panic. He turned to me, his face purple with rage, pulling a gun from his waistband. He shouted that he would kill me. He screamed that I had ruined him. I didn't flinch. I looked him in the eye and told him he could kill me, but it wouldn't save him. The commission didn't forgive thieves. He was already a dead man walking. I told him that I wasn't his hostage. I was his executioner. For a moment, the room was silent, heavy with the smell of fear. His fear, not mine. And then, the walls came down. It started with a crash that sounded like thunder inside the building. The steel door to the office didn't just open, it was blown off its hinges. Dante Sterling entered the room. He didn't look like a man who had been shot the night before. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, a hurricane of violence wrapped in a black trench coat. He held a silenced pistol in each hand. Petrov's guards tried to raise their weapons, but they were too slow. Dante didn't hesitate. 2 shots, 2 bodies hitting the floor before they could even pull a trigger. It was efficient, brutal, unstoppable. Petrov scrambled back against his desk, aiming his gun at me, using me as a shield. He screamed at Dante to stop. He shouted that he would blow my brains out. Dante stopped. He stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving slightly, the bandages under his shirt likely tearing with every movement. He aimed his weapon at Petrov's head, but he didn't look at Petrov. He looked at me. He was searching for fear. He was expecting to see the terrified waitress he had tried to send away. But he saw the queen. He saw me sitting calmly in the chair, eyes locked on his, signaling that I was in control. He saw the realization in my eyes that Petrov was already defeated. Dante lowered his gun just an inch. He understood. He realized that I hadn't come here to surrender. I had come here to win. Petrov was still shouting, babbling about a deal, about money, about anything to save his miserable life. He didn't realize that the man standing in front of him wasn't there to negotiate. Dante didn't say a word. He didn't offer a trade. He simply raised his arm, adjusted his aim with a microscopic shift, and pulled the trigger. The shot was a quiet thwip in the enclosed space. Viktor Petrov collapsed against the window, sliding down to the floor, the threat extinguished forever. Silence returned to the room. It was over. I stood up. My legs felt solid. I walked over to where Dante stood. He holstered his weapons. He looked tired, the pain finally showing in the lines around his eyes. But he looked at me with a mixture of awe and something darker, deeper. He didn't rush to hug me. He didn't ask if I was okay. That would have been an insult to the woman I had become. Instead, he reached out with his good hand. It was covered in gunpowder residue and dried blood. He offered it to me. It wasn't a hand offered to help a victim up. It was a hand offered to a partner, an equal. I looked at his hand, then up at his face. I thought about the life I was choosing. I thought about the danger, the violence, the moral gray areas I would have to navigate every day. But then I thought about the feeling of power when I faced Petrov. I thought about the man standing before me, who would burn the world down to keep me warm. I reached out and took his hand. His grip was firm, warm, and unbreakable. "Let's go home, Dante," I said. He nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. We walked out of the office, stepping over the wreckage of our enemies, leaving the old Elena behind in the blood-stained room. She was gone, and in her place stood a woman who was finally ready to rule. Here is the final script for Part 8, The Legacy, followed by the SEO optimization elements as requested in your uploaded files. Section, Part 8 Finale. Title, The Legacy Word Count, to 900 words. Script start. They say time heals all wounds, but I don't think that's true. Time doesn't heal wounds. It turns them into scars. And if you are lucky, those scars become a map of how you survived. It has been 7 years since I walked out of Viktor Petrov's warehouse. 7 years since I took the hand of a monster and agreed to rule the dark with him. I stood on the terrace of our estate in the Hamptons, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. The air here smelled of salt and wild roses, a stark difference from the stale beer and fear that used to define my life. I looked down at the garden. It was a sprawling maze of hedges and blooming flowers, meticulously maintained. In the center of it, a little girl with raven black hair was chasing a golden retriever. Sophia. My daughter. She was 6 years old, and she had her father's eyes, that piercing, intelligent blue that could see right through you. But she had my laugh. I took a sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I looked at my reflection in the glass door. The woman staring back at me wasn't Elena, the waitress, anymore. The cheap uniform was gone, replaced by a cashmere sweater and diamond studs that cost more than the entire debt I once owed. But the biggest change wasn't the clothes. It was the eyes. The girl who used to flinch at loud noises was dead. In her place stood the architect. That was what they called me now in the whispers of the underworld. Dante was the wolf, the muscle, the force of nature. But I was the architect. I was the one who legitimized the Sterling Empire. I was the one who set up the charitable foundations that built hospitals in the same neighborhoods we used to run. I was the one who shook hands with senators and judges, smiling that practiced smile while I subtly reminded them of the secrets we held. I realized that power wasn't just about guns. Guns were messy. True power was making yourself so essential to the system that the system would protect you at all costs. I watched Sophia trip over the dog and tumble into the grass. She didn't cry. She just giggled and pulled herself up, brushing the dirt off her knees. She's tough. Like her mother. I didn't turn around. I knew that voice better than my own heartbeat. Dante stepped up beside me, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his presence a heavy, comforting weight. He was older now. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and there was more silver in his hair. But he felt solid, indestructible. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He was wearing a simple sweater, looking less like a Mafia don and more like a man who had finally found peace. I leaned back into him. I told him that she wasn't just tough. She was fearless. And that terrified me. Dante kissed the sensitive spot behind my ear. The same spot he had touched that night in the penthouse when we were just two strangers sharing a bottle of whiskey. He whispered that fear was good. He said fear keeps you sharp. But he reminded me that we built this life so she wouldn't have to be afraid of the things we feared. We fought the wars so she could play in the garden. I turned in his arms to face him. I reached up and traced the scar on his jaw. I thought about the journey we had taken. I thought about the poison, the shooting, the warehouse, the blood we had spilled to get here. People called it a dark romance. They called it a tragedy waiting to happen. But they were wrong. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a victory. I told Dante that I used to think love was a weakness. I used to think that caring about someone gave your enemies a way to hurt you. He looked at me, his blue eyes softening. He asked me what I thought now. I looked over his shoulder at our daughter, who was now running back toward the house, waving at us. I told him I realized I was wrong. Love wasn't a weakness. It was the most dangerous weapon of all. Greed makes men sloppy. Fear makes men hesitate. But love gives you a reason to fight that is stronger than death. Love turns a waitress into a queen and a monster into a father. We had built a garden in hell, and against all odds, we had made it bloom. Dante smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. He kissed me, and for a moment, the rest of the world faded away. There were no enemies, no debts, no syndicates, just us. We turned back to watch our daughter run up the steps. The sun finally disappeared, plunging the world into twilight. But I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. I owned the dark, and as long as we stood together, nothing could ever touch us. Thank you for listening to this story. If you felt the tension, the heartbreak, and the triumph of Elena and Dante, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps these stories reach more people who need a little escape. And if you want to hear more tales of dangerous love and impossible choices, make sure you are subscribed to notifications. Until next time, remember, even in the darkest shadows, you can find your light.